In one of the churches that I served, the front wall of the church faced west, and there was a series of stained glass windows that started about 6 feet from the floor and went all the way up to the ceiling. About 4 o'clock on a bright, sunny winter afternoon, the setting sun over in the western sky would light those windows on fire. Now, each section of those windows told a piece of the biblical story, so each individual window had its own beauty. But when they came together, when that whole wall was lit on fire by the sunlight, the grand effect was one of stunning beauty. Today on Christ the King, our lessons give us a mosaic picture of Jesus the Christ. Each lesson gives a piece of that story, a certain piece of the story, and the overall effect is quite stunning. In the first lesson, the prophet Jeremiah speaks words of condemnation for kings who have ruled for the sake of their own interests, not the interests of the people, and more importantly, not in the interest of righteousness. Those kings, those evil final kings of Judah, made treaties to benefit themselves. They taxed the people heavily. They built palaces, and they purchased lives of luxury. And the judgment comes not only to those kings, but to the people of the land who refuse to make their rulers accountable to righteousness. And God then promises to raise up a new leader, a leader who will shepherd God's people. And this new one will guide and care for God's people with an eye towards righteousness, towards what's right, towards what's good, toward what's loving. Jesus in his ministry became this righteous shepherd. I am the good shepherd, he said. I know my own, and my own know me. The second lesson offers a very different picture, a grand poem about the cosmic dimensions of who Jesus is and who Jesus was. Here is the wide-angle lens, the panoramic view that takes in all time and all eternity. Here, Jesus is the one who was before God created anything, and who even after his ascension to the right hand of God rules all things. He's the one who has come to show us what God is like, so that when we look at Jesus, we have seen God. He is the one who, in all of history, is moving in him and through him and to him. All things will find their fulfillment. And oh, that picture in the gospel lesson. You could not find a sharper contrast to the cosmic reading of Colossians. Here, the wide-angle lens is taken off the camera, and we get a close-up of that dark, brutal moment when Jesus hangs on the cross accompanied by two thieves. The soldiers play a little gambling game to see who gets to take his clothes home as a brutal souvenir. The same soldiers mock him, assured by the reality of the Caesar in Rome that this one could not be king. And then comes this poignant moment when one of the criminals with Jesus, who is crucified with Jesus, senses that just maybe Jesus is who he says he is. And he asks Jesus to remember him. Even here on the cross, Jesus speaks words of grace and invitation. Today, you will be with me in paradise. Strangely enough, this gospel lesson gives us the picture that is at the heart of everything. No other picture of Jesus so clearly captures the essence of what he came for. Everything he came to do flows from the wellspring of love and grace centered in his cruel death. This was his mission. This is what he came for. The death on the cross is the single event that has saved us, that has brought us redemption and reconciliation, that has brought reconciliation even to a fallen world. It's odd. It is so terribly odd to claim the kingship of a crucified one. And yet that is exactly what we do. We make the sign of the cross on our bodies, reminding us that these bodies belong to that crucified and risen one. Our whole selves have their life in him. Our whole lives find their meaning in him. In him we have been given life with God that never ends. And so this is the one to whom we pledge our allegiance. Jesus is Lord, the early church said. And that is a deeply radical thing for us to say. Jesus is Lord. Because if Jesus is Lord, then Caesar isn't, regardless of who the current Caesar happens to be. You see, Jesus is a decidedly different king than anything we've been offered, ever. He refuses to come in power, but instead appears in abject vulnerability. He does not vow retribution, even on those who crucify him, but instead forgives them. He does not come down off the cross to prove his kingly status, but instead remains on that cruel instrument of torture and humiliation, the representative of all who suffer unjustly. And he does not promise a wealthy and prosperous tomorrow, but instead offers us life with God today. Did you notice that Jesus does not tell that repentant criminal that someday off into the future he will be with God? No, he promises that criminal today you will be with me in paradise. Today, in this very moment. My grandmother was a pious Christian. And as a child, when my sister and I would visit her house while Grandpa was off doing his work, Grandma would wander the house singing that old hymn. Those Missouri Synod Lutherans in the room, you will remember this hymn. I'm but a stranger here, heaven is my home. Earth is a desert drear, heaven is my home. You know, that has been the central piety of some Christians, pining for a distant and better future and sitting out the struggles and challenges of this world. But I see Jesus focused on this very moment. He promises that those who see in his vulnerability the revelation of God's mercy and grace will be in the circle of God's love right now. And the freedom that we are given right now as subjects of this crucified king is a freedom that receives the gift of salvation from now and takes up the mission of that crucified one in the world in this moment. You see, when Luke tells the story of the crucifixion, he emphasizes Jesus' innocence. Notice the words of the repentant criminal as he rebukes his comrade. We indeed have been condemned justly for getting what we deserve, but this man has done nothing wrong. For Luke, Jesus' innocence is of utmost importance. He reports it not to heighten the sense of tragedy, but to remind us that Jesus stands with all the innocent of the world, all the vulnerable, all the forgotten, all those who suffer injustice and oppression. And when he is raised, he promises God's life and God's vindication to all those that the world has similarly discarded. And so you see, that's part of the reign of Christ. And it's a good part of what it means to follow Christ the King. You know, we have been conditioned to think of our faith as a privatized thing that happens in the quiet of our hearts and in the quiet of our homes, where we can simply sit around and marvel that God loves us. But we do not confess a privatized faith that has nothing to do with what goes on in this world. The King Jesus, the crucified one, calls us to join God's insistent, consistent, and persistent solidarity with the weak and the oppressed and the forgotten of this world. You see, that's how the Church of Jesus Christ reveals itself as being faithful to its Lord. And whatever our understandable desire for strength and security is, God calls us to be on the lookout for the weak and the dispossessed, to stand with them, to sit with them, to relate to them, and to challenge our leaders to care for them as parents would care for their children, as good shepherds would care for their sheep. Worldly rulers offer their own compelling and attractive version of exercising power. You know, every time a candidate for any kind of office gets up, they promise safety and security in a time of unbelievable social upheaval. But if we choose to live in a world where might makes right, we will all eventually lose. And if we prefer a world where the rule of the day is an eye for an eye, then all of us will be blind, and eventually all of us will lay in ruin. Christ the King offers a different vision. Jesus not only promises us a future with life that never ends, not only does he redeem us today, not only does he forgive us for what we have done or not done, but he sets us free. A freedom, as Luther reminded us, is to become the servant of our neighbor, to continue the work that Jesus began, to stand with those in need, to work for our common good, to demand the just treatment of our neighbor, and to see in our neighbor the very presence and face of God. So, dear church, this is our King, Shepherd, ruler of the universe, the crucified one, who invites those of us who call him Lord to join him in his unlikely rule.